Good job.
I missed the bus
Right, okay. That
by like
explains it.
3 minutes. It's one of those you're walking down the road and the fucking thing
It
passes and
goes
you're like,
past you.
oh,
Right, here we go. Hello and welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast, where we take you inside Scottish politics. I'm Calum Macdonald. Hello, and here's Geoff Aberdein, who was Chief of Staff to the First Minister Alex Salmond. Hello, Geoff.
good morning.
And Andy Maciver was Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Hello, Andy.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for finding us and for listening. If this is your first time here, welcome and subscribe to the podcast so our episodes reach you every single week in your podcast feed. Coming up today then, there will be a by-election in Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse after the death of SNP MSP Christina McKelvey. We'll bring you reflections on her political impact, and we'll also consider that upcoming by-election, which will be before the summer recess, we understand. Also, President Trump's calling today Liberation Day. The start of 2025 has seen growing unease, unpredictability for businesses as they prepare for rising costs and escalating geopolitical tension, says the Fraser of Allender Institute. President Trump is going to introduce tariffs tonight at 9 p.m. UK time, so we'll have a consideration of those as well. And Kenny McCaskill is the new leader of the Alba party. What does that mean? We'll tell you more. You can watch all of this on YouTube, of course. Search for Holyrood Sources, where you can get full episodes, and you can subscribe there as well. You can follow us on X, you can watch clips on TikTok, and subscribe to the mailing list at holyroodsources.com. Just to say that in the next couple of weeks, we're going to do a dedicated Q&A episode where you can ask Geoff and Andy anything, or I suppose you could ask me, but I might not give you as good an answer as they can. So you can WhatsApp us right now with your questions. The number is 0333 404 6507, or you can email hello@holyroodsources.com, and we'll gather those up for our episode in a couple of weeks' time. Right, let's start here. Christina McKelvey, former SNP minister, died aged 57 last week after treatment for breast cancer. Her partner is Keith Brown, the SNP deputy leader, said she was a beloved mother to two sons and a grandmother who lit up every room she was in with her positivity and bright smile. Her death, of course, affected many at the Scottish Parliament. Staff and elected representatives. Committee meetings were suspended. Many MSPs were really quite emotional, visibly, upon hearing the news as well. Geoff, I think this is one of those moments where you think the Scottish Parliament actually is a relatively small place. Lots of, everyone knows everyone. Even if you're political rivals, there's kind of good friendship in there as well. It's a kind of difficult moment, I suppose, all of that.
Yeah, of course, whenever a parliamentary colleague leaves us, it's a very sad day. I thought the tributes to Christina were very fitting. I didn't know Christina too well, but I did, she was elected in 2007 when I became special advisor, so I got to know her a little bit. And there's two words that immediately came to mind for me, and those were, fun. She was a fun individual. She was fun to be around, and passionate. She was passionate about what she believed in. And I think she demonstrated that, particularly when she became a minister and portfolio that she was responsible for. So yeah, I mean, obviously our condolences to Keith Brown and the wider family. It's a huge loss, and actually I thought the tributes across the party divides were very fitting.
Yeah. How do you remember her? You kind of knew her a bit. Obviously you worked in the same party, etc. What do you think of?
There was one story actually I remember quite well, being a very young special advisor. I think it was 23, 24, and as was the way with things back then, after parliamentary day on Thursday, it's the last parliamentary day of the week, but maybe a few drinks had in one of the local bars. And I remember Christina and I ended up sharing a taxi down Leith Walk, and we didn't, I just said, "Oh, you're going Leith Walk direction, you're brilliant." So we jumped the taxi, and the taxi stopped for Christina, but it was actually just so happened, it was complete irony, it was my road as well. It was just off Macdonald Road. And I got out, and I think Christina thought I was chancing my arm, like, and she was like, "Where the fuck do you think you're going?" And I was like, "No, I actually live here too." No, that wasn't what I was. And that was kind of typical of her. She, right to the point.
Yeah, quite
Brilliant.
right too.
Yeah.
And Andy, class. Andy, that thing that I mentioned there about, across political divides, obviously the death of an MSP, I think, highlights that. You were in and around the Scottish Parliament as well. Did you encounter Christina McKelvey much?
A little bit in more recent years, just because of clients and her ministerial role. I don't have any stories like Geoff's. It must be said.
Not many people do.
I'll tell you what, though, I was in Parliament actually last Thursday. It was very early last Thursday morning that the news was announced, and I was in Parliament on Thursday as it happened for meetings. Anyway, there was obviously Christina had been ill for some time, and that was common knowledge, that was known about. But I did sense a real degree of shock actually amongst even our close colleagues, just at the speed of it all, and I don't think people expected it when it eventually happened. So there was a real sense of shock, a real sadness around the place. It was really a pretty somber place last Thursday, quite rightly so as well. So yeah, I mean, really sad and just awfully young. Still had a huge amount to give. And terrible news for Keith and the wider family. So obviously, much like Geoff, just thinking about them at this time as well.
Horrible time for sure. One of the political realities of a moment like this is that this means actually there will be a by-election in the constituency of Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse, which actually, the first thing I want to say about this is the first Holyrood by-election in 6 years. We're not really used to by-elections in the Scottish Parliament, I suppose. I guess there's a complication because of the PR element of voting, etc. Geoff, you can probably explain this better than I can.
Yeah, it's a good point. So obviously we have constituency and list MSPs. If a list MSP is no longer becomes an MSP for whatever reason, then they're just replaced by the next person on the list from the previous election when that happened. And it's only if a constituency MSP is no longer there that we would have a by-election. But even despite that, Calum, I hadn't actually realised that it does make sense. 6 years, it's a long time since that. I think this is going to be a fascinating one. I really do. I think incumbency is really important. I think Christina was well respected in her local constituency, and I think that'll help the SNP. But I was looking at the kind of two most recent by-elections I think we had last month in the kind of greater Glasgow area. It's not exactly the same constituency, but it's worth looking at it. And the SNP won them both. SNP in Glasgow North East on just 35% of the vote, and Southside Central 30% of the vote. Labour a close second, and the North East Reform putting up 23.6% of the vote. It's astonishing. Not so much in Southside, actually. The Green Party did very well. But I think, we've always said this with by-elections, they take on a life of their own, and they kind of sometimes mirror what's going on nationally in terms of sentiment towards politics. And I think that the SNP are on to win this. If it was held tomorrow, I think the SNP would win it. I'm intrigued to see what the Reform votes do. I think it's going to eat into the Labour vote. It's going to be fascinating to see what happens. But if I were John Swinney, I'd be quietly confident about winning it.
And did you agree with that? So this constituency, it's been highlighted by the Sunday Times actually just a few days ago, that the last time the people in Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse voted in a Scottish Parliament election, which was in May 2021, Reform UK, as it was, probably the Brexit Party at that point, got 58 votes. And so they say it's almost certain to be different this time, which I think, as Geoff's highlighting, is a sure thing. What is your read on where it's at?
I find it quite remarkable, actually. If you look at this seat, the makeup of this seat and the result last time, and the location and the sort of territory, it's inconceivable that in England this seat would be won by the incumbent. And you'd have obviously a huge Reform element. It's probably the sort of seat in England that Reform would win relatively straightforwardly. But in a Scottish context, here's why I find it pretty fascinating, is that you've got the SNP having been in power for, at this point, 18 years. 18 years. 4 elections won already. And having gone through a pretty torrid time over the last 3 or 4 years in particular, I genuinely cannot think of anywhere else in the democratic world where the incumbent would win this by-election.
Wow. That's astonishing.
And yet it may very well happen here. Now, that's not the SNP's fault. Well done to them
Yes.
for managing to
Yeah.
continue to achieve this all the time. But if the SNP win this by-election, every opposition leader should stand in front of the mirror and say, what on earth is going on here?
Yeah. I mean, Andy raises a really, really interesting point. You know, the laws of political gravity seem not to apply to the SNP in many ways. But I suppose a bit of word of caution around all this. The SNP are performing better, I think, since you know, John Swinney and Kate Forbes have come in. I think we all accept that. But they're not, you know, setting the heather alight. And I think they'd also accept that. It's been this phrase we've used many times as steadying the ship. But it is important to note that in all the national polling we're seeing, and in almost all of these local by-elections, their vote is still down. It's just that Labour can't seem to capitalise, and the other parties can't seem to capitalise for all the reasons we've documented on the podcast in terms of how the UK party particularly is performing, and that's adverse impact on Anas Sarwar and his troops. And so I get a sense that there's not people running the polls saying "Mon the SNP" right now. I still don't get that sense of enthusiasm. It's just that they're certainly not doing it for Labour either. And the reform thing could, I mean, Nigel Farage will come and visit this constituency. It's going to be, there's going to be a bit of a popcorn moment in the run up to this by-election. I sense it's going to be a huge moment because Nigel Farage will want to prove that he can take significant chunk of the vote in Scotland ahead of 2026. He'll want to set a marker down and use this as a way to kind of raise the profile and attract more people to his cause. I expect John Swinney to be actually opposing him. He'll be the focus of his opposition in this by-election as opposed to Labour, because he wants to be the antithesis of reform. How Anas Sarwar plays this is going to be a rock and a hard place there. He's got to go for the incumbent. He's got to go for the SNP. But his biggest threat to electoral success next year is actually reform. Really intriguing stuff.
Yeah, I think as well, the sort of the wisdom on by-elections is that they are different to kind of, you know, the set piece term elections, that sometimes they can be a protest vote, sometimes people will use them to stick it to one party or another and to send a message. Turnout might be slightly down, you know, people might not be quite as engaged. Andy, can we at this point say anything about this particular by-election? Could it be a big protest? Well, a year to go, whoever they vote for, they've only got to lump them for a year till May, and they can make another decision, the constituents here.
It will be a big protest vote, but it will be a protest against the Labour government at Westminster.
Right.
Not the SNP government at Holyrood. This is where, I mean, I'm a total broken record on this, but this is where the unionist parties need to look at themselves and say, why are we allowing the drivers for voting patterns in Holyrood elections to be completely based around Westminster? I mean, it's such an own goal.
But what can they realistically do? Because there's not going to be a Lib Dem Tory Labour pact, is there, in this by-election?
Of course there's not. No,
so what is it?
Look, the very short answer to what is a very long episode in itself is that in the long term, they can't continue to be aligned to their Westminster party. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work. They have to move to a Canadian model where there are separate parties. Don't say it, Geoff. Don't say it,
just to make me happy. I mean, would you characterise this as, you know, if the UK Labour Party sneezes, would you think the Scottish Party might catch a cold?
Listen, I'm going to get T-shirts made.
I mean, that's been on every episode.
And Geoff's going to buy one.
If that phrase hasn't been on every episode since the start of this year, I'd be shocked.
In all seriousness, though, to go back to your first part of your question, Calum, not only should an incumbent government for 18 years lose this seat in a normal election, it should get annihilated in a by-election.
By-election, yeah.
I mean, it should get annihilated in a by-election. So this is where we are in a very odd political construct here, where this doesn't happen.
Yeah, and so the SNP.
I do accept that, and your analysis is pretty sound. I do think that the unknown from 18 months ago was this rise of reform, which I think a lot of people thought was a bit of a flash in the pan. They're sticky. They're sticking around. It seems they're winning. They're winning a few by-elections in England that they're challenging very closely in second place if they're not winning them. I think that's the bit that's caught them on the hop. The Tories and the Labour Party on the hop a bit, which feeds into your narrative.
And just I don't want to present this as being a sort of completely, like a penalty with no goalkeeper for the SNP. I mean, to a significant degree it is, but I do think we have to also acknowledge, it is only fair to acknowledge that, of course, the SNP's fortunes are dictated quite heavily by the performance of Labour at Westminster, but we can't underestimate the absolute revolution in the perception of the SNP since John Swinney and Kate Forbes took that party over. I mean, that is a factor. So it's not only the case that Labour polling is going down. If you look at the polling, the SNP polling is starting to tick back up again, and that is because of Swinney and Forbes. We can't belittle just the massive turnaround that they have created in this party. It is there. There's no question about it.
I've been thinking about that a bit since we've been talking about it the last couple of weeks, and I do wonder. I was thinking about Professor Sir John Curtis's comments to us at the start of the year that 2026 will be a blame election. Who do voters in Scotland blame for however bad they're feeling, whatever malaise they're feeling economically, with public services, etc. So there's that part of it. And then the other part of it, I wonder, is that feeling of malaise. Sure, they've steadied the ship, but at some point the narrative can change to you're not changing anything. Things are just chugging along as they kind of always have. Nothing is feeling different. And I do wonder if that's a risk that they're running, that if they can't point at some sort of revolution, something has got dramatically better, that actually people will say, well, sure, you've steadied things, but you're keeping us in second gear here. We need to step things up a bit.
Yeah, I think it's a fair challenge, Calum. In terms of the by-election, though, the context we find ourselves in, I think we think it's going to be before the summer recess.
Yeah.
So what we're thinking, that's got to be within the next sort of 3 months, essentially. I just don't see too much changing.
Yeah.
But I do accept that point ahead of the election in 2026. I think the SNP need to come to the table with a bit more than just steadying the ship. It's not on John Swinney. I've known John a long time, a lot of respect for him, but it's not in his character to push the envelope. He's a lot more managerial in his way, and I'm not trying to make him sound boring. It's just the nature of the guy. He doesn't like to be bold for bold's sake. And I think one of the roles that Kate will have to play in this is say, no, First Minister, we can't just rest in our laurels and hope that everyone thinks Labour are rubbish. We're going to have to advocate change, a change in policy, a change in direction that appeals to the electorate. Else we might find that we're just gifting as well votes to Reform, because bet your bottom dollar Reform are going to be campaigning on heavy change. And folk, we've seen how it can work. I'm sure we'll do another podcast on whether we think that's good or bad or indifferent, I'm sure. But the point is, they're going to be coming to the table with a lot of change. And the SNP has to be clear what vision they have for the country. I'm still not sure what it is, if I'm being honest with you.
Just a final kind of thought on the by-election, which is, I think, going to be fascinating, is the electoral significance of by-elections. Geoff, you said sometimes they can take on a life of their own. I think the timing of this is incredibly fascinating. A year to go to the Scottish parliamentary election, then you've got the constituency itself. In 1967, Winnie Ewing won the Hamilton by-election and famously said, "Stop the world. Scotland wants to get on." Now, that was one of the most important victories, clearly, for the SNP, but actually I think it could be argued, political agendas aside, that is one of the most significant by-elections for Scotland and the story of devolution as well. This is a hugely significant seat, and my question to you both is, the narrative that the party that wins can then deploy and use in the build-up to 2026, because if the SNP win, it could actually completely energise their campaign. Similarly, if Labour were to pull out the bag somehow, then actually they would be rocket boosters to 2026, wouldn't they, Andy?
Yeah, I mean, clearly they will not expect to do that. But if you remember, the Rutherglen by-election that was won by Michael Shanks did give them, I think, a bit of confidence that they could actually, that voters could vote for them. It was really the first test that they had under the new regime in Scotland of voters being able to vote for them. And that did happen, and it carried through to the election. So, I mean, clearly they would be delighted at that. Look, I might have read this wrong. I can't see any kind of storming Labour victory here. I think
no, but imagine it, because that would be the strategy for Sarwar writes itself, doesn't it? At that point, if they got it.
Yes, it does. But if they get a Labour victory, all the pollsters will have to pack up and go home and rethink their entire models. I mean, you've got a situation where Labour's support has fallen off a cliff since the general election. Layered on top of that, you've got Reform support rising and SNP support stabilising and rising a bit as well. So, and that, well, okay, that's true nationwide, but there's no evidence really that it's any different in this seat. So if that did happen, if Labour did record that victory, it would be absolutely stunning. There's no question about that. But I think a lot of pollsters would be scratching their heads and saying, hold on, we must have everything wrong if Labour are winning that seat, because at the moment it just looks deeply unlikely.
Yeah, a few points. I'd like to pull up my colleagues for a second. If you recall, in the run-up to that by-election, Rutherglen, Andy told us they didn't matter at all, really, by-elections, and now he's suggesting that was the confidence booster that the Labour Party needed.
Well remembered.
I mean, thank you for coming.
I rememred it as I was saying it as well.
Podcast.
I also recalled this, and I'm not surprised that your memory has picked this up. It didn't change the 2024 election result. All it did is it made Labour realise they could actually win.
Andy, I think you need to quit while you're behind. Quit while you're behind. Look, second point I'd like to make is money and finances. Don't underestimate how well financed Labour will be. Perhaps better than the SNP, given obvious reasons. The difficulty with the SNP's finances. Reform will be very well financed going into this. Now, there is obviously rules about how you can distribute that in a by-election, but nonetheless, that's something to consider. There might be a bit of an equalising effect there. And the other point is, and you raised it with Winnie Ewing, will Fergus Ewing be campaigning for the SNP in the seat that his mother so famously won? What a message that might send of party unity. I'm not sure if that's going to be possible. We'll wait and see. But yeah, listen, whoever wins it will have their tails up going into 26. No doubt about that. And if Reform do perform well, I mean, they don't have to do anything to perform well. What is success for them? That's the point.
Yeah,
they can say, oh, well, we've upped their vote by coming to such a low base. It doesn't even matter, I suppose. It's but anyway, all very fascinating, and it will heat up massively in the weeks to come. I can tell you that.
Yeah, we'll keep you up to date on that. So it is expected, the by-election is expected to take place before the summer recess, so that's the end of June is when that happens. So yeah, over the next couple of months. Right, let's go on, because this last few months has been a sense of growing unease for businesses in Scotland as they prepare for, quote, rising costs, escalating geopolitical tension, most notably the introduction of trade tariffs by US President Trump. This is according to the Fraser of Allender Institute. Today, President Trump is expected to announce what's been billed as reciprocal tariffs on other countries. But actually, it's reported this morning that what's likely to end up here is universal taxes on all overseas products entering the United States. The president's expected to set different rates of tariffs for different countries and different trading blocs. But there's speculation that the UK's £60 billion of exports to America will be hit with a 20% tariff to match Britain's VAT rate, even though that's something that's levelled on all products, regardless of origin as well. Of course, the Scottish implication in all of this is huge. Most notably, during Trump's first term, there was a 25% tariff on Scotch whisky, and that caused huge harm. It was a £600 million in lost exports was the hit, which is roughly £1 million per day of the tariffs there. So, I think, Andy, the Fraser of Allender Institute analysis is helpful here. Rising costs, escalating geopolitical tension. It's that feeling, I think, for businesses of uncertainty. They've got national insurance contribution rises on the way as of this coming Sunday. They've got President Trump, who has been talking about tariffs since he came into office, and he's going to impose them at, we think, 9:00 p.m. tonight, UK time, Wednesday night. This is so difficult for businesses to deal with.
Yeah, and it's pretty difficult for businesses in Scotland as well, because the exports outlook in Scotland is quite different to what it is UK-wide. If you look at the UK-wide exports to the US, it's quite heavily based on, I think I'm right in saying machinery, actually, plant equipment and so on, whereas that is not quite the same if you look at Scotland uniquely. Obviously, what we think about in Scotland are actually our food and drink, whiskey and salmon being two very obvious examples. Whiskey is the biggest drinks export in the UK, salmon's the biggest food export in the UK, and the US is a very big market for both of them. There's a couple of things that I do find quite important. One is that Trump is from Lewis, as we know, and he does play on that heritage a little bit, and he does outwardly at least appear to, as much as he kind of cares about anything, it does tug at him a little bit, I think, that heritage. And ironically, these exports will be very damaging for remote and rural areas, because that's where the jobs are that are employed by the salmon and whisky sectors. So, they will have an outsized impact on Scotland compared to the UK. They will also have an outsized impact on remote and rural Scotland compared to other parts of Scotland as well, I suspect. And you cited the figures from whisky from the last time. So, I think that's an important consideration, and I think people should be scratching their heads saying, okay, I wonder what we can do with Trump here, just to play on that particular angle, and whether there's anything that we can do for whiskey and salmon that just tugs at Trump. The answer is probably no, but it might be worth a try. I think the second thing to be aware of here as well is that, Scotland has a certain amount of powers, but not all, obviously. That's a different debate. I'm not going to get into that one again, lest Geoff picks me up on being a nationalist.
Again.
But I do think it is therefore incumbent on John Swinney and Kate Forbes to look at the situation and say, okay, what can we do within the powers we've got to make Scotland the most attractive possible business location? We know we're going to take a hit with this stuff, so we've got to try to get a competitive advantage over our nearest neighbours on the continent and our nearest neighbours in the UK. Is Scotland really the most attractive place in the UK to do business? And if not, what can we do to make it the most attractive place in the UK to do business? My answer to the first part is no, it isn't. And my answer to the second part is, well, let's get around the table and decide how to do that, because I think now more than ever we need to.
Yeah, I've got a number of thoughts on this, and we're not international trade experts, and we shouldn't present ourselves as such, but we did raise the issue of Scotch whisky and salmon with Anthony Scaramucci, the Mooch, when we had him on the podcast, and outlined the importance of those two sectors to the Scottish economy. I suppose I've got a number of different points I want to make. For those who criticise John Swinney for trying to meet with Trump, or exploring a meeting with Trump, or even when he met with Eric Trump a couple of weeks ago, this is why you do it. When you've got such a maverick, an uncertain figure, somebody that will perhaps listen to the last person he spoke to, you try everything to try and protect your Scottish interests, and he clearly has an affinity with Scotland, so try and play that to your advantage. It doesn't mean to say you endorse his politics. You try and influence in the Scottish national interest. So anyone that's criticising that needs just to wise up, in my opinion. The second thing is, for Britain more widely, we are a service economy largely, and we do have some significant produce. We've talked about the Scotch salmon, Scotch whisky. Andy Maciver mentioned machinery and machine parts. There's a smaller kind of car sector here. I would recommend anyone, if they can find it, Ed Conway on Sky News did a feature on car production, really worth watching in terms of how this all works. People think that cars are just built in a certain country. The reality is they get their components from China, elsewhere, all the rest of it. It's fascinating. So really worth watching to understand how this all might play out. But we're a service economy, and it got me thinking, when we've heard Reeves talk about proving oil and gas fields a better successor regime, is he now, is Starmer now realising, we need to produce more ourselves and not be exposed to what could become a very, very volatile trade war? So perhaps that's an indication or an influencing factor on their policy decisions in that regard as well. And the final thing is Brexit. We've got the EU being pretty strong and saying we are going to retaliate like for like if you hit us with tariffs. You've got Mark Carney in Canada saying pretty punchy stuff in a similar vein, whereas Starmer's playing a much more reserved game, still trying to play this bridge over troubled waters, as I put it, the bridge between the European continent and America, and trying to barter a better deal for the UK. Early signs are that's not been successful, but we'll find out later today. But pretty sure soon, depending on the outcome, the Starmer's going to have to pick a side, because politically he will look weak if he's saying nothing at all, in that sense. And I'm not saying that his strategy so far is wrong, incidentally. I think, as I mentioned earlier, he's trying to do what's in the best interest of the United Kingdom. But at some point, he's going to have to say what his response to this is going to be. And he's going to have to look internally at his own economy and what we can produce more, what we got to barter with, and externally to see who he wants to partner with in terms of responding to this. Unbelievable stuff, guys. Really
It's
is.
astonishing.
It really is.
And President Trump has got the world at his feet at this point. We are all sitting around waiting for 9 o'clock tonight in this event in the Rose Garden called Make America Wealthy Again, is what it's been billed as. Although actually there's an interesting note in the reporting that they reckon that there's speculation in the White House that they've scheduled it after US markets close because they think there's going to be an immediate freefall. And so there's this kind of, everyone's just waiting. This is astonishing.
But the greatest irony of this, of just very briefly into US politics, the greatest irony is that Trump's biggest calling card, his biggest strength as perceived by the American electorate, has always been the economy. He's good on business. And now, any poll you look at across all polling companies, whether it's Fox News or CNN, it does not matter where they may come from ideologically. They're all saying that Trump's economic policies are not good for the country. The American people are against it, and they haven't actually taken effect yet. So let's not underestimate that this is a big risk for Trump as well, and his long-term reputation. Yes. But it's astonishing.
It's a long-term risk. I mean, the problem with tariffs is that in the very, very short term, in the host country, in the home country, they can actually look like they've worked quite well. They never do in the long term, but in the short term they can. I think, though, this is the difficulty of not working in a kind of aligned way. Because America's so big and because it has an impact on every country, the incentive for individual countries to basically roll over and get their tummy tickled is actually quite high, because they will want to just mitigate the worst consequences on themselves, on their own country. And pretty much, to one degree or another, most countries are rolling over and asking for their tummies to get tickled, apart from next door in Canada, where Carney is basically just saying, no, screw you, I'm not even going to talk to you. And is reaping the electoral benefits of that as well, it must be said, big time. But the incentive for others to do whatever they need to do to protect themselves and submit themselves to Trump is very strong, and Starmer inevitably will do that to at least some degree.
Yeah. I think Carney's fascinating. We should talk more about Mark Carney, depending on how his general election goes, I suppose, and the campaign goes, because I think that tone is actually so noticeably different from other world leaders at this point. Right, well, stand by. Liberation Day is what Donald Trump is calling it. We'll see what happens. Right, let's finish the podcast today talking about Kenny McCaskill, who has pledged to deliver Alex Salmond's dream of independence for Scotland. He's been elected as the new leader of the Alba party. Kenny McCaskill won the leadership contest with 52.3% of the vote. Ash Regan got 1,212 votes, 47.7%. It was a pretty close run thing, actually. What am I looking at here? Just over 100 votes in it. Geoff, I'm going to just say now, we're going to speak to Kenny McCaskill on this podcast. You'll hear him next week, actually. So we'll have a chat with the new Alba party leader. What can he do? It's interesting that in our by-election conversation a few minutes ago, we didn't mention the Alba party, and I wonder if in a nutshell, and that wasn't deliberate, by the way, I just wonder if in a nutshell that's the problem.
Yeah, well, what can he do? That's your question. It's not an easy task, but the first thing he's got to do is bring the party together. You just mentioned it. A very, very close vote with Ash Regan, and try and display this as a united front. So bringing Ash Regan close. She's the only Alba represented in the Scottish Parliament, so she's clearly going to have a role to play. They need to have a united front first and foremost. You cannot be successful without building from that platform. And there's some other issues around others that have been disappointed and voicing their anger and frustration at what they see as injustices in the election contest and so on and so forth. Second thing they need to do is coalesce around a message which isn't reliant on the SNP playing ball at the next election. They tried that previously. The SNP didn't play ball and it didn't work out for the Alba party. You can't keep trying the same thing and hoping it will succeed. One thing I will say to Kenny's credit, I thought in one of his speeches I picked up post victory that he basically said we can't. I'm paraphrasing here, but the essence of the speech was we can't just keep criticising the SNP. We can't go to war with the SNP. Now that is good politics because, quite frankly, if you're trying to present a united nationalist cause, then you can't be sitting there just chirping from the sidelines at everything the SNP say or do. So that's the next stage. And thirdly, I think they need to. This is the most difficult part when you're a small party, is establish apparatus, a much more credible apparatus in and around the region. It sounds process driven, but I don't think they can call on good party networks all around the country just yet. They've got good people, I'm sure, that campaigners on the ground, but they're not a party infrastructure that is really ready to compete with the SNP or Labour or Tories at this stage. But those are the three things I think that they need to look at. Well done to Kenny, though. He's an absolute stalwart. I worked alongside him in government. I have a lot of respect and time for Kenny. I'll say it again. I've never really been a fan of the Alba party in terms of the reason it was established. I said that when Alex Salmond did it. I said it to him and advised him against it. But he's there, and they can find a niche in this marketplace, but they have to do the basics right first.
Andy.
So roll back 4 years to 2021. Alex Salmond standing for the Alba party in his own patch in the northeast, needing 7% of the vote to get himself a list seat or thereabouts, and didn't do it. And I don't think, if I remember rightly, I don't think it was actually even that close to doing it. Okay, a few percent. And that was when the rival was in place. That's when Sturgeon was there. The reason I'm saying that is because I say to myself now that without, the giant of Alex Salmond being in charge, without the rival of Nicola Sturgeon being there, with John Swinney being there instead, who I guess to a lot of Alba supporters is more palatable than Nicola Sturgeon is, I don't understand what it is that makes somebody decide right now in this election to vote for Alba instead of voting for the SNP. And fundamentally, I think that is what the Alba party's problem is. What is the point in voting for Alba? We'll ask Kenny next week. That's their problem, though. I don't know if there's a credible answer to that question.
I mean, just very quickly, there is a credible point to be made. If the SNP keep performing well in the polls, then there is this argument that a vote for the SNP on the list is a wasted vote. But that, I can see that credible argument, but that's the point. That's what they put forward at the previous election, and of course it was rebuffed. It's all very well to say to John Swinney, will you vote for Alba on the list? But why would you do that? What is the incentive for John Swinney? The only incentive I can see is presenting a purely united front and a common strategy to try and achieve independence. It seems a bit of a long shot right now, in summary. But yeah, let's not waste today. Let's put these questions to Kenny next week.
Exactly. And if you've got questions for the new Alba party leader as well, of course, you can get in touch. And more than that, if you've got questions for Geoff and Andy, it's high time we did a Q&A episode with them. So you can WhatsApp us and we'll save them up. And you'll hear that in a couple of weeks. The number is 0333 404 6507 or email hello@holyroodsources.com. Geoff and Andy, thanks both. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe, tell your friends, and we'll talk to you again next week.